The rain fell like divine judgment upon the cobblestones of Cheapside, turning the debt auction into a theater of misery. Arabella Huxley stood beneath a tattered parasol that had once been ivory silk, now the color of old dishwater, and watched her former world dismember what remained of her dignity. £20 for the escritoire, the auctioneer bellowed, his voice cutting through the drumming rain. Fine mahogany, barely a scratch, belonged to the late Lord Huxley himself. Arabella's fingers tightened around the parasol handle until her knuckles went white. That escritoire had been her father's favorite piece. He'd written his correspondence there every morning, his hand steady and sure, never imagining that 3 years after his death, strangers would paw at it like carrion birds. 30, someone shouted. 45. The crowd pressed closer, a mass of dripping wool and hungry eyes. Arabella caught sight of herself in a shop window across the street, a pale ghost of the girl who had once waltzed at Almack's in gowns worth more than most of these people earned in a year. Lady Arabella. The voice cut through the auction din like a blade wrapped in honey. How delightful to see you've come to witness the festivities. Arabella didn't need to turn to know who spoke. Lady Clarissa Pemberton materialized beside her like a perfumed storm cloud, flanked by 2 other ladies whose names Arabella couldn't quite recall. She'd never needed to remember the names of background characters before. Lady Clarissa. Arabella's voice was frost over stone. I hadn't realized vultures dressed so fashionably these days. Clarissa's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. Oh, my dear, is that bitterness I detect? How unbecoming. She leaned closer, her breath warm against Arabella's ear. Though I suppose we must forgive you. It's not every day one watches their entire life sold to the highest bidder. The parasol trembled in Arabella's grip. She forced herself to breathe, to maintain the composure that was all she had left. I do hope you've secured alternative arrangements, Clarissa continued, examining her gloved fingers with studied disinterest. I heard the most distressing rumor that Lord Weatherby has purchased your family's debts. All of them. She paused for effect. He's quite eager to discuss terms of repayment, in private. Arabella's stomach turned to ice. Lord Weatherby was 70 if he was a day, with hands that wandered and breath that reeked of rotted teeth and brandy. The thought of those hands on her skin. Nothing to say? Clarissa's smile sharpened. How unlike you. Though I suppose pride is a luxury you can no longer afford. Something snapped inside Arabella's chest. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a door closing forever. Actually, she heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady, I have secured arrangements. I'm to be married. Clarissa's eyebrows rose. Married? To whom? Surely no gentleman of quality would... She caught herself. But the damage was done. No, Arabella agreed, her mind racing ahead of her words, propelled by desperation and spite in equal measure. No gentleman of your acquaintance, certainly. She swept past Clarissa, her ruined skirts trailing through puddles, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no plan, no scheme, only the burning need to escape the pity and cruelty in those watching eyes. The crowd parted before her as she approached the auction block, where the household goods had given way to something far more grim. The human offerings. Debtors, mostly, selling their labor to pay what they owed. But there were others, too. Men from the workhouses, the prisons, those who had nowhere else to turn. They stood in a ragged line, some defiant, some broken, all desperate. And at the end of the line, partially obscured by shadow and rain, stood a man who didn't belong. He was taller than the others, broad-shouldered despite the obvious hunger in his frame. His clothes were little more than rags. His dark hair hung long and matted to his shoulders, and a vicious scar cut across his jaw like a lightning strike. Shackles bound his wrists, but he wore them with an unsettling stillness, as if they were merely decorative. When he lifted his head, Arabella's breath caught. His eyes were gray as winter storms, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and seen, truly seen, for the first time in months. There was intelligence in that gaze, sharp and assessing, at odds with everything about his circumstances. "The next lot," the auctioneer droned. "A laborer, strong back, no family, no encumbrances. 7 years of service to settle his debts. Shall we start at £10? Arabella's hand rose before her mind could catch up with her body. £100, she declared, her voice ringing clear across the suddenly silent crowd. "And I claim him not as a servant, but as a husband." My sweet family, before we continue with Arabella's story, like and share this video and tell me where you are watching from. I read every comment. And also, subscribe if you haven't. Now, let us continue with the story. The gasp that rippled through the assembly was worth every penny of the sapphire ring she would have to sell to make good on the offer. Arabella kept her gaze locked on the man in shackles, whose expression hadn't changed, though something flickered in those storm-gray eyes. Amusement? Curiosity? "My lady, that is," the auctioneer sputtered. "This is most irregular. I have the funds," Arabella interrupted, reaching into her reticule for the ring, the last valuable thing she owned. Her grandmother's ring, worth far more than £100, but worth far less than her freedom. "And I believe the law is clear. A woman may choose her husband from among the debtors if she assumes his obligations." It was an archaic statute, rarely invoked, but it existed. She'd stumbled across it weeks ago while desperately searching for any escape from Weatherby's clutches. Behind her, Clarissa's voice rose in outrage. "This is absurd. She's making a mockery." "Yes," Arabella said, finally turning to face her tormentor with a smile that felt like broken glass in her mouth. "I suppose I am. But at least I'll be a married woman making a mockery, which is still more respectable than a spinster at the mercy of creditors." The man in shackles made a sound that might have been a laugh. The cottage squatted on the edge of nowhere, like a rotting tooth, its thatched roof patchy and its windows clouded with grime. Arabella had never seen it in daylight before. Her solicitor had shown her the deed by lamplight in his dusty office, presenting it as if it were a prize rather than a punishment. "Your mother's dower property," he'd said. "Modest, but yours free and clear." Modest. The word echoed hollowly in her mind as the hired cart creaked away, leaving her standing in ankle-deep mud with a silent stranger who was now, legally and impossibly, her husband. Gideon, she'd learned his name from the auction papers, stood motionless beside her, his newly freed wrists still bearing the angry red marks of the shackles. He carried nothing because he owned nothing. The rain had finally stopped, but water still dripped from his matted hair, tracing the scar along his jaw. "Well," Arabella said, hating how her voice wavered. "This is it. Our home." He said nothing. He'd said nothing during the brief, awkward ceremony performed by a bored magistrate. Nothing during the cart ride through increasingly rural landscape. Nothing as she'd stolen glances at him, trying to reconcile what she'd done with the enormity of having done it. Arabella lifted her sodden skirts and picked her way toward the door. The key stuck in the lock, rusty from disuse, and she had to struggle with it, very aware of the large man standing behind her. Finally, it gave with a reluctant groan. The interior was worse than she'd feared. One room, essentially, with a smaller space partitioned off that might charitably be called a bedroom. Furniture consisted of a listing table, 2 chairs that had seen better decades, and a straw mattress that looked like it might harbor several generations of mice. The hearth was black with old soot, and spider webs decorated the corners like macabre bunting. "I know it's not," Arabella began, then stopped. What was the point? They both had eyes. She turned to face him, acutely conscious of being alone with this man for the first time. In the dim light filtering through dirty windows, he seemed impossibly large, his shoulders nearly spanning the doorway. The rags he wore did nothing to conceal the lean muscle of someone accustomed to hard labor or violence. The scar suggested violence. What had she done? What had she been thinking? "The bedroom is yours," she said quickly, pointing to the partitioned space. I'll make do out here. And I want to be clear, this is a marriage in name only. For legal protection, nothing more." Still, he said nothing. But he moved, and Arabella's heart leapt into her throat as he crossed the room in 3 long strides. She backed against the table, her mind screaming warnings even as she lifted her chin defiantly. He reached past her. For a moment she couldn't process what was happening. Then she saw the wood, a neat stack tucked beside the hearth that she hadn't noticed. He gathered several logs with casual efficiency and knelt before the fireplace. Arabella released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She watched, bemused, as he examined the hearth with the focus of a scholar studying a manuscript. His hands, large and scarred, moved with surprising delicacy as he cleared away old ash, arranged kindling, and produced flint from somewhere in his ragged clothing. Within minutes, flame bloomed to life. "How did you—" she started, then caught herself. Of course he knew how to start a fire. He'd probably lived rough for God knew how long before ending up in that auction. The thought should have frightened her more than it did. As warmth began to spread through the miserable little room, Gideon rose and moved to the windows. Arabella watched as he examined each one with methodical care, testing the latches, running his fingers along the frames. At the 3rd window, he paused, then did something with his hands. She couldn't quite see what, and the loose frame suddenly sat more securely. "You're a carpenter?" she ventured. He glanced at her, those gray eyes unreadable, then returned to his inspection of the cottage's defenses. Because that's what it was, she realized. He was securing their shelter with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood danger. Her stomach chose that moment to remind her that she hadn't eaten since a stale roll that morning. The sound was mortifyingly loud in the quiet cottage. Gideon's attention snapped to her immediately. Before she could speak, he was moving again, out the door and into the overgrown garden behind the cottage. Arabella followed, compelled by curiosity and something else she couldn't name. He moved through the weeds and brambles like he could read the landscape, occasionally stopping to examine something. When he knelt, she saw he'd found wild herbs, rosemary growing woody and neglected, and something else she didn't recognize. He harvested them with careful precision, never taking too much. 20 minutes later, she sat at the crooked table drinking tea. Tea. He'd found her tea. Not the fine blend she'd once taken for granted, but something herbal and warm that settled her stomach and nerves in equal measure. He'd boiled water in a dented pot she'd missed, steeped the herbs in a chipped cup he'd washed in the rain barrel, and set it before her without fanfare. He took nothing for himself. "You should have some too," Arabella said softly. He shook his head, once, then returned to examining the door's hinges. "I don't understand you," she said, watching him work. "You don't speak. You don't react. Most men would have demanded something by now, explanations at least, or... She couldn't finish the thought. Gideon straightened and turned to face her fully for the first time. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. He took 3 measured steps toward her, and Arabella forced herself not to retreat, not to show the fear fluttering in her chest. He stopped at a respectful distance, then slowly, deliberately, placed his hand over his heart. The gesture was courtly, incongruous with his appearance. Then he pointed to her, to the cottage, to the door he'd been repairing. The meaning was clear. I'm here. I'll protect this. I'll protect you. Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. I bought you like livestock. Why would you? His expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something warming the ice in his eyes. He tapped his temple, then his chest, then made a gesture she didn't understand until she realized he was mimicking her standing before the auction block, chin high despite the rain and ruin. He'd seen her courage, and it had mattered. Arabella's throat tightened unexpectedly. I wasn't brave. I was desperate. He shook his head, firm in his silent dissent. Then he returned to his work, and she was left alone with her tea and the growing realization that her impulsive marriage might not be the disaster she'd feared. It might be something far more dangerous. It might be hope. Arabella had never understood how exhausting poverty could be until her hands started bleeding. She stared at the split skin across her palms, earned from 3 hours wrestling with the cottage garden, and felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. A month ago, her greatest concern had been whether her gloves matched her parasol. Now she couldn't afford gloves at all, and her hands looked like they belonged to someone else entirely. You're gripping the hoe wrong. She startled so badly she nearly dropped the tool. Gideon stood at the garden's edge, and the shock of hearing his voice, low and rough from disuse, but unmistakably educated, left her momentarily speechless. You speak, she said stupidly. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his scarred face. He crossed to her side and gently took the hoe from her ruined hands. When there's something worth saying. His fingers brushed hers, and she noticed how careful he was not to touch the raw places. Then he demonstrated the proper grip, the efficient angle, the way to let the tool's weight do most of the work. He made it look effortless. How long have you been able to speak? Arabella demanded, torn between indignation and fascination. Always. He handed the hoe back, positioning her hands correctly. But listening tells you more than talking ever could. Before she could formulate a response to that maddening piece of philosophy, he'd moved away to examine the potato bed he'd planted the previous week. The conversation, apparently, was over. That was how the days passed. Gideon would offer sparse instruction in the practical arts of survival, how to coax fire from damp wood, which wild plants were edible, how to patch a roof with rushes and prayer. Then he would retreat into silence, working with tireless efficiency while Arabella struggled to master skills she'd never imagined needing. She learned to bake bread, though her first attempts emerged from the oven like charred bricks. She learned to carry water without sloshing half of it down her dress. She learned that her body could ache in ways she'd never conceived possible, and that sleep earned through honest labor was deeper than any she'd known in her feather bed. But it was the nights that puzzled her most. She would wake in darkness to find Gideon's straw mattress empty, the cottage silent except for the settling of old wood. The first time, she'd been frightened. By the fourth night, she was curious enough to rise and peer through the grimy window. He stood in the moonlight beyond the garden, perfectly still, his attention fixed on something she couldn't see. Then, as she watched, a figure emerged from the trees. A man dressed too well for their poor corner of the world, leading a horse too fine for their rutted road. Arabella pressed closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. The stranger handed Gideon what looked like papers. They spoke for several minutes, their voices too low to carry. Once, the stranger bowed, actually bowed, and Gideon's posture shifted into something commanding, authoritative, before he seemed to catch himself and soften again. When the stranger left, Gideon stood for a long moment staring at the papers in his hands. Then, to Arabella's surprise, he walked not back to the cottage but to the dilapidated shed he'd been repairing. She should have returned to bed, should have respected his privacy. Instead, she wrapped herself in the threadbare shawl that was now her only luxury and slipped outside. The shed door was cracked open, lamplight spilling through. Arabella approached as quietly as her clumsy feet would allow and peered inside. The transformation was startling. What had been a jumble of broken tools and rotted wood was now organized, almost austere. But it was the man who commanded her attention. Gideon sat at a makeshift desk, planks laid across sawhorses, surrounded by papers covered in neat script and complex figures. A proper lamp, far too expensive for their circumstances, illuminated his work. His scarred hands moved across the documents with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling important correspondence. As she watched, he dipped a pen in ink and wrote something in a hand so elegant it might have belonged to a royal secretary. The concentration on his face was absolute, and in that moment, he looked nothing like the ragged man she'd claimed at the auction. He looked like someone who commanded empires. "You can come in," he said without looking up. "You're not as quiet as you think." Arabella's cheeks burned, but she pushed the door open fully. "Who are you?" "Your husband." He signed something with a flourish, then set the pen aside and finally met her eyes. "As you so publicly declared." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters." He began gathering the papers, and she noticed how careful he was to keep the writing away from her line of sight. "You should be sleeping. Tomorrow we need to repair the chicken coop if we want eggs." "We don't have chickens." "We will by afternoon." He said it with such certainty that she didn't doubt him. A farmer 2 miles south is willing to trade 3 hens for help mending his fence. "You arranged this? When?" "I listen, Arabella, and I walk. There's much to learn in the space between dawn and breakfast." She moved closer, studying him in the lamplight. "Those papers, that man who visited, the way you write, you're not what you pretended to be at that auction." "I pretended nothing." His voice was soft but firm. "I was exactly what I appeared to be. A man in chains. Waiting. Waiting for what? For someone brave enough to see past the shackles." He stood towering over her in the small space, but somehow she wasn't frightened. For someone who would choose character over comfort. For you, as it happens. Arabella's heart hammered against her ribs. "That's absurd. You couldn't have known I would—" "No," he agreed. "I couldn't have known. But I hoped." He reached past her to extinguish the lamp, his arm brushing her shoulder. In the sudden darkness, his voice was even closer. "Hope is all any of us have, in the end. Now go to bed, wife. The chickens won't wait for your beauty sleep." The endearment, spoken in that educated rumble, sent an unwelcome flutter through her stomach. She retreated to the cottage, her mind spinning with questions that multiplied faster than answers. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of a lock engaging. Not keeping her out, she realized. keeping his secrets in. The village market was a riot of noise and commerce that made Arabella's head spin. She'd never had to navigate such a place before. Servants had always handled the vulgar business of purchasing food. Now she stood clutching a basket that contained 3 eggs and a small fortune in coppers, trying to determine which vendor's bread was least likely to break her teeth. "The baker on the corner," a woman said, noticing her hesitation. "Old Thomas. His loaves are dear, but they're honest." Arabella managed a grateful smile. The villagers had been wary at first. Strangers always were in small places, but her obvious incompetence at basic tasks had apparently made her harmless in their eyes. "Poor thing," she'd overheard one farmer's wife say. "Gentry born, fallen on hard times. At least she's got that strapping husband to keep her fed." That strapping husband was currently 3 stalls away, examining a plow blade with the intense focus he brought to everything. Arabella had argued against his coming. She could manage a simple market trip alone. But Gideon had simply looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and followed anyway. She was beginning to suspect he couldn't help himself. She'd nearly reached old Thomas's stall when a familiar laugh cut through the market din like a knife through silk. Arabella froze, her basket suddenly heavy as lead. No, not here. Not now. But God or fate or simple cruel coincidence had other plans. Lady Clarissa Pemberton emerged from a shop across the lane, flanked by 2 gentlemen Arabella recognized from London's ballrooms. Lord Wickham and Sir Peter Ashford, both younger sons with too much money and too little character. Clarissa's eyes found Arabella immediately, and her expression transformed into something that might have been delight if delight weren't supposed to be pleasant. "Lady Arabella?" She swept forward, her traveling dress probably worth more than the entire cottage. "What an extraordinary surprise. I'd heard rumors you'd buried yourself in the countryside, but I scarcely believed it." Arabella forced her spine straight, summoning the posture that had once been second nature. "Lady Clarissa. Gentlemen, I didn't realize this area attracted London society." "Oh, it doesn't," Clarissa said sweetly. "We're merely passing through on our way to Lord Harrington's estate. But when I heard there was a village nearby, I simply had to stop. One does enjoy observing how the simple folk live." Her gaze traveled pointedly over Arabella's worn dress, her work-roughened hands, the pathetic basket. "Though I see the observation goes both ways." Lord Wickham snickered. Sir Peter simply stared at Arabella with an expression that made her skin crawl. "If you'll excuse me," Arabella began, "but we've only just encountered you." Clarissa linked her arm through Arabella's with false warmth, steering her away from the baker's stall. "You simply must tell us everything. How are you managing? Is your husband keeping you adequately provided for?" The emphasis on husband dripped with mockery. Arabella tried to extract her arm, but Clarissa's grip was surprisingly strong. "I manage perfectly well, thank you." Of course, of course." Clarissa guided them toward a quieter corner of the market, the 2 men following like hounds, scenting blood. "Though I confess, I've been dying of curiosity. Your wedding was so rushed. We never got to meet your mysterious groom, the slave you purchased so dramatically. Do tell, is he terribly brutish? Does he beat you? I've heard that men of that class—" "He is nothing of the sort," Arabella snapped, finally wrenching her arm free. "And this conversation is over." Sir Peter stepped closer, blocking her path. Now, Lady Arabella, that's no way to treat old friends." His breath reeked of gin despite the early hour. "We're merely concerned for your welfare. A lady of your breeding, shackled to some common laborer." I'm told he can't even speak, Lord Wickham added, circling to her other side. Is it true? Did you marry a mute? How deliciously Gothic. Arabella's heart hammered. The market suddenly felt too close, the crowd too far away, to notice her distress. She clutched her basket like a shield. Let me pass. In a moment, Sir Peter said, reaching for her arm. First, I think you owe us an explanation. Your father owed my family money, you know, quite a lot of money. I think that debt transfers to you, don't you? Perhaps we can discuss terms of repayment. His fingers never reached her. One moment Sir Peter was leering at her. The next he was sprawled on the ground, the back of his coat gripped in a large, scarred hand. Gideon stood over him like an avenging angel, rendered in flesh and fury. His expression so coldly controlled, it was terrifying. Touch my wife again, Gideon said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, and you'll lose the hand. The market had gone silent. Arabella watched, stunned, as her silent husband transformed before her eyes. Gone was the careful subservience, the rough laborer's stoop. He stood at his full height, and it was considerable, his bearing radiating a power that made Lord Wickham actually step backward. Sir Peter scrambled to his feet, red-faced. How dare you? Do you know who I am? Yes. The single word was spoken with such withering contempt that Sir Peter actually flinched. The question is whether you know who you've just threatened. Something in his tone made even Clarissa hesitate. Gideon's hand remained extended toward Arabella, an invitation and a claim all at once. She took it without thinking, and his fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness. This ends now, Gideon continued, his gaze sweeping across all three of them. You will not approach her. You will not speak to her. You will forget you ever saw her here. Am I understood? You can't simply, Lord Wickham started. Gideon's attention snapped to him, and whatever Wickham saw in those gray eyes made him swallow his words. Can't I? Test that assumption at your peril. He moved with fluid grace that spoke of extensive training, positioning himself between Arabella and her tormentors. The gesture was protective, but there was something else in it. A coiled readiness that suggested he wouldn't merely defend, but destroy if necessary. Who are you? Clarissa whispered, her usual confidence cracking. Gideon's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. I'm her husband. That's all you need to know. He paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, for now. He turned then, tucking Arabella against his side and guiding her back toward the market proper. The crowd parted instinctively, and Arabella heard the whispers starting. Did you see? What was that? Moved like a soldier, spoke like a lord. Her hands were shaking. Gideon stopped at old Thomas's stall, purchased bread with calm efficiency, then led her toward the road home. Neither spoke until the village disappeared behind them. You didn't have to do that, Arabella finally said. Yes, Gideon replied simply. I did. They'll talk, they'll wonder, let them. She stopped walking, forcing him to stop as well. Gideon, what you just did, how you moved, how you spoke, that wasn't a laborer defending his wife. That was, what? His expression was unreadable. I don't know, she admitted, but I intend to find out. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so tender it stole her breath. Not yet, he said softly. Trust me a little longer. And despite everything, the secrets, the mysteries, the impossibility of it all, she found that she did. The first messenger arrived on a Tuesday, riding a horse that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. Arabella was hanging laundry, a task she'd finally mastered without dropping everything in the dirt, when the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. The rider was a severe-looking man in his middle years, dressed in black from collar to boot, his bearing military straight. He dismounted with practiced efficiency and surveyed the cottage with an expression that suggested he'd smelled something foul. "I'm looking for—" He paused, consulting a slip of paper. "Gideon Rathbone." Arabella's stomach tightened. No one ever came looking for Gideon. They existed in careful isolation, their poverty a moat that kept the world at bay. "Who's asking?" The man's gaze swept over her with the same distaste he'd shown the cottage. "Tell him Blackwood is here. He'll understand." Before Arabella could respond, Gideon emerged from the garden, dirt on his hands and something carefully blank in his expression. "Blackwood, you're early. The situation has escalated." Blackwood's tone was clipped, professional. "We need to discuss—" His eyes flicked to Arabella. "Privately." Gideon's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "My wife can hear anything you have to say." The word wife seemed to pain Blackwood physically. "With respect, this is a matter of—" "My wife," Gideon repeated, and there was iron in his voice. "Speak or leave, Blackwood." The man's nostrils flared, but he reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed letter. "The northern properties are hemorrhaging money. Your man in Northumberland, says the situation is critical. Decisions must be made, and soon." Properties. Plural. Arabella's hands stilled on the damp shirt she'd been hanging. Gideon took the letter, breaking the seal with a familiarity that spoke of frequent correspondence. His eyes scanned the contents, and something dangerous flickered across his features. "Tell Carmichael I'll have instructions by week's end. The usual method." "The usual method is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain," Blackwood said stiffly. "Questions are being asked. Your absence has been noted." "Then let them ask." Gideon's tone brooked no argument. "Week's end, Blackwood." The messenger's mouth compressed into a thin line, but he bowed, actually bowed, and returned to his horse. Within moments, he was cantering back down the rutted road, leaving nothing but dust and questions in his wake. Arabella waited until the hoofbeats faded completely before speaking. "Northern properties? It's complicated." Gideon folded the letter and tucked it inside his shirt. "I'm not simple-minded, Gideon. I can handle complicated." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes. "Not yet," he said finally. "Soon. I promise you, soon. But not yet." "Are you a criminal?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "Is that why you were at that auction? Are you hiding from the law?" Something that might have been a laugh escaped him. "No, Arabella. I'm not a criminal." "Then what? Who are these people who keep arriving in the dead of night? What are these properties? Why does a man dressed like an undertaker bow to someone living in a hovel? The answers you want aren't the answers you need." "Not yet." He stepped closer, his hands hovering near her arms but not quite touching. "Trust me. Please. Just a little longer." "You keep asking me to trust you while keeping secrets that could—" She stopped, a horrible thought occurring to her. "Are you married? Is there another wife somewhere? Is this all some elaborate—" "No." The word was fierce, almost violent. "There is no other wife. There is only you. There has only ever been you." The intensity of his declaration left her breathless. "That's impossible. You didn't even know me before the auction." His expression softened into something that might have been sadness. didn't I?" Before she could parse that cryptic response, he was walking away toward the shed that housed his secrets. Arabella stood among the wet laundry, her mind churning with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. The second messenger came 3 days later, then a third. Then they began arriving with alarming regularity, always well-dressed, always deferential to Gideon, always carrying letters or packages that disappeared into the locked shed. Arabella tried to ignore it. She focused on the garden, on the chickens that had indeed appeared as promised, on mastering the art of making edible stew. But the questions gnawed at her, like rats in the walls. She began watching more carefully, noticed how Gideon's rough accent slipped sometimes, revealing cultured vowels beneath, noticed how he held himself when he thought she wasn't looking, the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Noticed the signet ring he wore on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, that she glimpsed once when he was working shirtless in the garden. She'd seen that crest before, in London, in important houses. One night, unable to bear it any longer, she waited until his breathing deepened in sleep and crept to the shed. The lock was good, far better than anything else on their property. But she'd watched him open it enough times to know he kept the key on that same chain as the ring. Her hand was on the shed door when his voice cut through the darkness. "I wouldn't, if I were you." Arabella spun. Gideon stood in the cottage doorway, bare-chested, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. Not angry, precisely. Just weary. "I deserve to know," she said, hating how her voice shook. "I'm your wife, Gideon. In name, yes, but still. These people who come and go, these secrets. What if they put us in danger? What if they put you in danger?" "They won't." He crossed the distance between them. "I would burn everything to ash before I let any harm come to you." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I can give." He cupped her face with work-roughened hands that were somehow still gentle. "Arabella, my stubborn, brave, infuriating wife. What I'm asking, the patience I need from you, it's not fair. I know that. But it's necessary." "For what?" "To keep you safe. To keep us safe." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "And to give you the choice you deserve when the time comes." "What choice?" Instead of answering, he kissed her forehead, a gesture so achingly tender it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Then he led her back to the cottage, away from the shed and its secrets. And she let him. But that night, lying on her straw mattress, listening to his breathing in the darkness, Arabella made a decision of her own. If he wouldn't tell her the truth, she would find it herself. The letter arrived on a morning that had started deceptively pleasant. Arabella was kneading bread. Her loaves were almost respectable now, when she heard the approaching carriage. Not the single horse of Gideon's mysterious messengers, but the full rattle and creak of a proper coach. Her hands stilled in the dough. No one they knew owned a carriage. Through the window, she watched a gleaming black landau pull to a stop before the cottage, looking as out of place as a diamond in a pigsty. The driver, liveried and stiff, descended and opened the door. A footman, an actual footman, stepped down first, then turned to assist his passenger. Lady Clarissa Pemberton emerged like a queen, surveying conquered territory. Arabella's stomach plummeted. She looked down at herself, flour-dusted, wearing a dress that had been mended so many times it was more thread than fabric, her hair tied back with a scrap of ribbon. Then she looked at the cottage, seeing it suddenly through Clarissa's eyes. The sagging roof, the patched walls, the chickens scratching in the dirt. This was a mistake. Coming here was a mistake. But there was nowhere to run. "Lady Arabella," Clarissa's voice carried false warmth across the yard. "I do hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was simply overcome with concern after our encounter in the village. I said to myself, Clarissa, you simply must call on poor dear Arabella and see how she's managing." The footman was already unloading baskets from the carriage. Arabella stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron with as much dignity as she could muster. "Lady Clarissa, this is unexpected." "Oh, I should have sent word, but I was seized by such impulse." Clarissa gestured to the baskets. "I've brought provisions, some decent tea, proper bread, a few other necessities. Consider it an act of Christian charity." The words were daggers wrapped in silk. Arabella's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice level. "That's very generous, but unnecessary. We manage quite well." "Manage?" Clarissa's gaze swept the cottage with theatrical concern. "My dear, you're living in a hovel. There's no shame in accepting help from old friends." "We're not friends." Now. Clarissa moved closer, her expensive perfume clashing with the honest smell of chickens and earth. "I know you're proud, Arabella. It was always your most endearing and most tiresome quality. But pride won't keep you fed." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And between us, I'm not the only one who's concerned. Everyone in London is talking about your situation, your dramatic marriage to that man. Some are even planning to visit, though I convinced them to let me come first, to assess whether you're suitable for company." The threat was clear. Clarissa had come as an advance scout, and her report would determine whether Arabella faced a parade of mockery disguised as concern. "Where is your husband, by the way?" Clarissa's eyes glittered. "I'm simply dying to make his proper acquaintance. After his rather aggressive display in the village, I feel we got off on the wrong foot." "He's working." Arabella gestured vaguely toward the fields. It was true Gideon had left at dawn to help a neighboring farmer, trading labor for supplies. She'd never been more grateful for his absence. "Working? How industrious." Clarissa clasped her hands together. "Then we have time for a proper chat. You simply must invite me in for tea. I insist." It wasn't a request. The footman was already carrying baskets toward the cottage, and Clarissa swept forward with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied entry anywhere. Arabella had no choice but to follow her own former peer into her own meager home. The interior looked even worse with Clarissa in it. The lady's gown probably cost more than every stick of furniture combined. She made a show of looking around, her expression cycling between pity and poorly concealed delight. "How rustic," Clarissa murmured, trailing a gloved finger along the rough-hewn table. "You've certainly embraced the pastoral life, haven't you?" "I've embraced survival," Arabella said flatly. She busied herself with the kettle, grateful to have something to do with her shaking hands. "Yes, I can see that." Clarissa settled delicately on one of the rickety chairs, testing it as if it might collapse beneath her. "Tell me, Arabella, and please be honest, are you happy? Truly? Because if you're in some sort of distress, if that man is mistreating you in any way, there are options. Lord Weatherby, despite everything, has expressed continued interest in resolving your family's debts, with certain considerations. Of course." Arabella's hand clenched around the kettle handle. "I would rather starve." "You may well do so." Clarissa's mask slipped slightly, revealing the venom beneath. "Look at you. Look at this place. You were meant for ballrooms and estates, not shoveling chicken manure. And for what? Some scarred brute who can barely string 2 words together? He's worth 1,000 Lord Weatherbys. Is he? Clarissa leaned forward. Then where did he come from, this paragon? Why was he in chains at a debtor's auction? What's his family name? His prospects? His past? She paused, letting the questions hang. You don't know, do you? You married a complete stranger out of spite and desperation, and now you're paying the price. Each word landed like a blow because they were true. Arabella did know almost nothing about Gideon's past. She had married a stranger, and she was paying a price, though not the one Clarissa imagined. I've made my choice, Arabella said quietly. Choices can be unmade. Clarissa stood, smoothing her skirts. I'm hosting a small gathering next week at Lord Harrington's estate. Just a dozen or so of our closest friends. I'd like you to attend. I have no interest in, I insist. The steel beneath Clarissa's sweet tone finally showed fully. Bring your husband? Let him be seen in proper society. Let everyone judge for themselves whether Lady Arabella Huxley has found happiness or simply another form of prison. Her smile sharpened. Unless, of course, you're ashamed of him. The trap snapped closed with perfect precision. If Arabella refused, she confirmed every ugly rumor. If she accepted, she subjected Gideon and herself to the savage scrutiny of people who would delight in tearing them apart. I'll discuss it with my husband, Arabella managed. Do. Clarissa moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Arabella? Everyone will be there. Everyone who matters. Lord Weatherby, the Ashfords, even some of the royal set. It will be quite the occasion. She let that sink in. I do hope your husband owns appropriate clothing, though I suppose we could arrange something if he doesn't. Charity, after all, comes in many forms. After Clarissa's carriage disappeared in a cloud of dust and triumph, Arabella stood in the cottage surrounded by baskets of expensive provisions that felt like payment for her humiliation. She wanted to throw them all into the fire, wanted to scream, wanted to weep. Instead, she returned to her bread dough, kneading with a violence that would have scandalized her old etiquette teacher, and waited for Gideon to come home. She had no idea how to tell him they'd just been invited to their own public execution. Gideon knew something was wrong the moment he crossed the threshold. Arabella stood at the table with her back rigidly straight, attacking a carrot with a knife as if it had personally offended her. The cottage reeked of expensive perfume, and baskets of provisions he certainly hadn't purchased lined the walls like accusations. What happened? He asked, setting down the sack of grain he'd earned. We've been invited to a party. Her knife came down with particular viciousness. At Lord Harrington's estate, next Saturday. Gideon went very still. Harrington's estate. Lady Clarissa extended the invitation personally. The carrot didn't stand a chance. She was very insistent. It seems all of London society is gathering to observe the spectacle of my fallen state. And to meet you, of course. My mysterious husband. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She called it charity. Christian concern for an old friend. But we both know what it really is. A execution dressed as a social call. Gideon's voice was flat. Yes. Arabella set down the knife with trembling hands. And I don't know how to refuse without confirming every terrible thing they think about us. About you. But if we go... She laughed, a broken sound. If we go, they'll tear us apart for entertainment. You don't know these people, Gideon. How cruel they can be when they scent weakness. He crossed to her side, tilting her chin up with gentle fingers. Then we don't show them weakness. How? Look at us. Look at this place. She gestured wildly. You own one decent shirt. I have a single dress that isn't held together with hope and thread. We'll arrive in a farmer's cart while they descend from gilded carriages. They'll laugh at us before we even speak. Let them, Gideon said. But something dark flickered behind his eyes. Their laughter means nothing. It means everything. Arabella pulled away, pacing the small space. You don't understand. This is my world, my former world. I know how it works. The whispers, the cutting remarks disguised as compliments, the way they'll dissect every word, every gesture, every... The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her spiral. Gideon's expression went carefully blank in a way that now set off alarms in Arabella's mind. Stay inside. Gideon. But he was already moving toward the door. Through the window, Arabella watched another fine horse arrive. This one carrying Blackwood and a second man she didn't recognize, elderly, distinguished, wearing spectacles that caught the late afternoon light. She couldn't help herself. She followed Gideon outside. Absolutely critical that you reconsider, Blackwood was saying as she emerged. The northern situation requires your immediate presence. This charade has gone on long enough. I'll thank you to remember your place, Blackwood. Gideon's tone could have frozen fire. The older man cleared his throat. If I may, your don't. Gideon cut him off with a single word. Then, seeming to sense Arabella's presence, he turned. The look on his face was resigned. Arabella, meet Mr. Pemberton, my solicitor. And you've met Blackwood, your steward, Arabella finished slowly. Pieces were clicking together in her mind with sickening clarity. Not a criminal associate. Your steward, managing your properties. She looked at the men, their expensive clothing, their deferential postures. How many properties, Gideon? The silence stretched like a drawn blade. 17, the solicitor said finally. Currently, though the northern estates are technically Pemberton. Gideon's voice was deadly quiet. Go back to London, both of you. I'll send instructions when I'm ready. But the Harrington affair, Blackwood started. What did you say? Arabella's voice was sharp. Blackwood had the grace to look uncomfortable. Lord Harrington's gathering. We received intelligence that Lady Clarissa Pemberton, no relation, he added hastily, has been making inquiries. She's discovered enough to be dangerous. If you attend that party as a common laborer, and she exposes even a fraction of the truth, then what? Arabella demanded. What truth? What exactly are you all so desperate to hide? Gideon's jaw clenched. Arabella, not like this. No, I think exactly like this. She rounded on him, months of confusion and secrets boiling over. You have 17 properties. You have a steward and a solicitor. You receive correspondence sealed with a ducal crest. Yes, I've seen it. You move like a soldier, speak like a scholar when you forget to hide it, and men with power bow to you in the mud. Her voice broke slightly. Who are you? Before Gideon could answer, another voice shattered the moment. Why, he's nobody at all, my dear. Just a clever con artist who saw an opportunity. Arabella spun. Lady Clarissa stood at the edge of the property, having arrived silently in a smaller carriage. Her expression was triumphant. How fortuitous that I decided to return with one more basket of provisions. Imagine my surprise at finding such distinguished visitors at a pauper's cottage. Lady Clarissa, Gideon said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. You're trespassing. Am I? How delicious. She glided closer, her eyes darting between the horses, the well-dressed men, Arabella's stricken face. Tell me, do these gentlemen know about your theatrical marriage? Your touching poverty? Or are you running some elaborate scheme on them as well? Madam, I must insist, Pemberton began. Oh, you must insist on nothing. Clarissa's laugh was crystalline and cruel. I know exactly what I'm seeing. A charlatan with delusions of grandeur, taking advantage of a desperate woman and likely embezzling from his true employers. She turned to Arabella with false sympathy. My poor dear. He's not even a successful criminal. You've truly scraped the bottom of the barrel. Something in Gideon snapped. Arabella saw it happen, the final thread of restraint breaking. He drew himself to his full height, and the transformation was terrifying. Gone was every trace of the humble laborer. What remained was pure, concentrated authority. You will be silent. His voice cut like a blade, each word perfectly enunciated with an accent that belonged in Parliament or the palace. You will return to your carriage. You will forget everything you've seen here, and you will thank God that I'm in a merciful mood. Because the alternative? He stepped forward, and Clarissa actually retreated. The alternative is that I remind you exactly who I am, what I can do, and how very small your world becomes when I decide to crush it. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the chickens seemed to hold their breath. Clarissa's face had gone white. You can't I? Gideon's smile was terrible. Test me, Lady Clarissa. Please. I would enjoy the exercise. The raw power radiating from him was undeniable. This wasn't a laborer pretending to authority. This was someone who wore power like a second skin and had temporarily set it aside. Clarissa fled to her carriage without another word. As the wheels disappeared down the road, Arabella finally found her voice. Gideon, tell me the truth. Right now, all of it. He turned to face her, and she saw resignation in every line of his body. My name is Gideon Rathbone. I'm the Duke of Rothschild. I own half of Northumberland and a sizable portion of Yorkshire. That auction where you found me? His laugh was bitter. I arranged it, every detail. I needed to disappear to root out corruption in my northern holdings. I needed everyone to believe the Duke had vanished. Arabella's world tilted. You're a Duke? Yes. And our marriage? Completely legal, completely binding. He stepped toward her, and completely unplanned. You were never supposed to be part of this, Arabella. But then you stood in that rain, and you chose me. Not because of what I owned or who I was, but because you saw someone who needed freedom as much as you did. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I married a duke. You married me, he corrected gently. Everything else is just noise. The royal summons arrived at dawn, delivered by a courier whose livery bore the unmistakable seal of the crown. Arabella stood in the doorway of the cottage in her nightdress, staring at the cream-colored envelope as if it might bite. The Duke and Duchess of Rothschild are hereby commanded to attend the Grand Ducal Ball at Carlton House on Saturday next, in celebration of His Majesty's birthday. The words swam before her eyes. Duchess. The title felt like a costume several sizes too large. 3 days had passed since Gideon's revelation. 3 days of careful distance and careful words. Of Gideon sleeping in the shed and Arabella lying awake in the cottage, her mind churning with the impossible reality of her situation. She'd married a duke. She was a duchess. The man she'd pitied, protected, was one of the most powerful peers in England, and she had no idea what to do with that information. Gideon emerged from the shed as the courier departed, already dressed despite the early hour. He took one look at the summons in her hand, and his expression shuddered. "It's time, then," he said quietly. "Time for what?" "For me to return to London, to resume my duties." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "The northern corruption has been rooted out. My stewards have the evidence they need. There's no reason to maintain this charade any longer." The word stung. Is that what this was? A charade? You know it wasn't. Finally, he looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was raw. "But the choice I mentioned before, the one you deserve to make. It's here now, Arabella. You married a man you thought was a slave. You agreed to poverty, to hardship, to a life at the margins. You never agreed to be a duchess. You didn't give me the chance to agree or disagree. You lied. I did. No defensiveness, just stark acknowledgement. I had my reasons, and I thought they were good ones. But that doesn't change what I took from you, the right to choose your life with full knowledge of the facts." Arabella's fingers crumpled the summons. "So what happens now?" "Now I go to London. I attend the ball, fulfill my obligations to the crown." He paused, and something vulnerable crossed his features. "And you decide whether you want to come with me, not as the woman who had no choice, but as someone who knows exactly what she's choosing. That's not fair." "No," he agreed. "None of this has been fair to you. But I'm trying, Arabella. I'm trying to give you the autonomy I should have given you from the beginning." He moved past her into the cottage, gathering the few possessions that were truly his, which, ironically, were almost nothing. The man who owned 17 estates packed his life into a single worn bag with practiced efficiency. "Blackwood will come this afternoon," Gideon said, not looking at her. "He'll bring a carriage, funds, anything you need. If you decide to attend the ball, he'll escort you to Rothschild House in London. If you decide—" He swallowed hard. "If you decide you want an annulment, Pemberton will handle the arrangements quietly. You'll be provided for, regardless. Generously." "You're giving me permission to leave you?" Arabella's voice cracked. "I'm giving you the choice I should have offered from the start." He finally faced her fully. "I love you, Arabella. I've loved you since you stood in that rain and chose courage over comfort. But love isn't enough if it's built on deception. You deserve better than that. Better than me." The confession, so raw, so unexpected, stole her breath. Before she could formulate a response, he was moving toward the door. "Gideon, wait." He paused at the threshold, his back to her. "The ball is Saturday evening. If you come, I'll know your answer. If you don't—" His shoulders rose and fell with a heavy breath. "If you don't, I'll know that too. Either way, you'll never want for anything. I'll make sure of it." Then he was gone, striding toward the road where a simple horse waited, nothing ducal, nothing grand, just a mount suitable for a man trying to disappear one last time before stepping back into the light. Arabella stood in the doorway and watched him ride away, the summons crumpling further in her white-knuckled grip. The cottage felt cavernous without him. She wandered through the single room, seeing evidence of Gideon everywhere: the chair he'd repaired, the hearth he'd restored, the small improvements he'd made with quiet competence. Outside, the garden thrived with the vegetables he'd planted. The chicken coop he'd built stood sturdy against the wind. He'd made a home here, for them. Or had he simply been playing house while waiting for his real life to resume? Blackwood arrived precisely when Gideon had promised, accompanied by a carriage that looked absurdly opulent against the cottage's shabby backdrop. He emerged with his usual severe expression, but something in his eyes might have been sympathy. "Your Grace," he said, bowing properly for the first time. The title sounded strange applied to her. "I'm here to assist with whatever you require." "I require answers," Arabella said. "Real ones. No more secrets, no more careful omissions. If I'm meant to decide my future, I need to understand my past. Our past." Blackwood's mouth compressed, but he nodded. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. Start with why a duke would arrange to be sold at a debtor's auction." Over tea, proper tea from the baskets Clarissa had brought in her poisonous charity, Blackwood explained. The corruption in Gideon's northern estates had been extensive, systematic. His own stewards had been embezzling, his managers accepting bribes, his tenants suffering under exploitation that happened under his own seal. When Gideon discovered it, he'd realized the rot went deep enough that a conventional investigation would simply send the guilty scattering. So he disappeared, arranged his own capture at a manufactured debt auction, become invisible to observe the truth. He lived rough for 3 months before that auction, Blackwood said quietly. Deliberately made himself unrecognizable, endured considerable hardship, all to gather evidence. And he was supposed to be purchased by one of his own agents, Arabella guessed. Someone who would spirit him north to continue the investigation. Yes, your intervention was entirely unexpected. Blackwood's lips twitched with something that might have been a smile. I've never seen him so thoroughly thrown by a variable he hadn't anticipated. He could have told me. After the wedding, he could have explained. Could he? Blackwood's gaze was unexpectedly kind. Would you have believed him? A man in rags claiming to be a duke? Or would you have thought him mad, dangerous? Arabella had no answer for that. He was going to tell you, Blackwood continued, after the northern business was concluded. He had a plan. There's always a plan with His Grace. But then you defended him in the market. Protected him from your former peers, showed him who you truly were, without the influence of his title or wealth. He paused. I think that's when he realized how unfair the entire situation had become. You'd chosen him for himself. The reveal would change everything. So he kept lying. So he kept trying to be worthy of the choice you'd made. Blackwood set down his teacup with careful precision. I've served the Rothschild family for 30 years, Your Grace. I've never seen the Duke like this, uncertain, vulnerable. You've undone him rather thoroughly. Arabella looked at the summons, now smoothed flat on the table between them. The ball. What happens if I go? You'll be presented to the crown as the Duchess of Rothschild. Every eye in England will be upon you. Every tongue will wag about the mysterious woman the Duke married in secret. It will be, he searched for the word, intense. And if I don't? His Grace will attend alone, face the speculation and gossip alone. And then he'll come back here to this cottage to hear your decision in private. Blackwood's expression softened infinitesimally. Either way, the choice is entirely yours, as it should have been from the beginning. After Blackwood left, Arabella sat in the cottage as afternoon faded to evening. She thought about the man who'd started her fires and planted her garden, the man who'd defended her with terrifying grace, the man who'd held her trust in his scarred hands and tried his best not to break it, even while keeping impossible secrets. The man who loved her, who'd said it plainly, without artifice, and then walked away to give her the choice he'd denied her before, Saturday. The ball was Saturday. Arabella looked down at her work-roughened hands, then around at the cottage that had become a home, and began to make her decision. Carlton House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light spilling from every window like liquid gold. Arabella sat in the Rothschild carriage, because of course there was a Rothschild carriage, gleaming black with the ducal crest emblazoned in silver, and tried to remember how to breathe. The gown Blackwood had procured was a masterpiece of emerald silk that made her skin luminous and her eyes brilliant. Her hair had been dressed by a lady's maid who'd appeared at Rothschild House with the efficiency of a conjurer. Jewels, actual jewels, not paste, glittered at her throat and wrists. She looked every inch a duchess. She felt like an imposter. "Your Grace," the footman said gently, opening the carriage door. "We've arrived." The crush of carriages was extraordinary. Every peer of consequence had answered the royal summons, their equipages jostling for position as ladies in impossible gowns and gentlemen in severe evening dress descended like a flock of exotic birds. Arabella caught sight of familiar faces, Lord Weatherby, looking ancient and lecherous as ever. The Ashford brothers. And there, emerging from a carriage dripping with ostentation, Lady Clarissa Pemberton. Their eyes met across the cobblestones. Clarissa's face cycled through shock, confusion, and dawning horror as she took in Arabella's transformation. The Duchess's jewels alone could have purchased Clarissa's entire wardrobe twice over. Arabella lifted her chin and swept past without acknowledgement. The entrance hall was a cathedral of marble and gilt. Announcements echoed as guests were presented. The Earl and Countess of Weatherby, Sir Peter Ashford, Lord and Lady Pemberton. Arabella's hands trembled. She'd sent word to Blackwood 3 days ago, a single sentence. "I'll attend." Nothing more. She had no idea if Gideon knew she was coming, what he thought, what he expected. She had no idea what she expected herself. The Duchess of Rothschild. The announcement cut through the din like a blade. Conversation didn't just pause, it stopped. Every head in the entrance hall swiveled toward her. Arabella forced her feet to move, forced herself to glide rather than flee. The crowd parted before her, and she felt their stares like physical touches. Heard the whispers starting, a susurrus of shock and speculation. "That's her? That's the woman? Impossible. The Duke's wife was some bankrupt nobody. She's wearing the Rothschild emeralds. I heard he found her in a workhouse. She kept walking, kept her expression serene, kept breathing." The ballroom doors loomed ahead, thrown open to reveal a space so magnificent it defied description. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages, mirrors that multiplied the crowd into infinity. And at the far end, on a raised dais draped in royal purple, Arabella's breath stopped. The peerage sat in careful hierarchy, arranged by rank and favor. But even in that glittering assembly, one figure commanded attention with gravitational inevitability. Gideon sat in the position of highest honor, immediately to the right of the empty throne that awaited His Majesty. He wore midnight blue velvet that made his broad shoulders heroic, his dark hair trimmed and tamed, though it still held that slight wildness that no barber could fully conquer. The scar on his jaw, that mark she'd traced with her eyes 100 times, looked not brutal, but distinguished in the candlelight. But it was his eyes that held her. Those storm-gray eyes that had watched her from the shadows of an auction block, that had studied her with quiet intensity across the cottage table, that had looked at her with something too fierce to be mere affection. He'd been watching the door, waiting for her, When he saw her, his entire body went rigid. Something crossed his face too quickly to name: relief, hunger, hope, fear, all tangled together into an expression so raw it made her chest ache. Then he rose. The movement sent a ripple through the assembly. Dukes did not rise casually, particularly not when seated in positions of such prominence. But Gideon stood with the fluid grace that had always marked him, stepping down from the dais as if compelled by forces beyond protocol. He crossed the ballroom floor toward her. The crowd melted away, giving them a corridor of space that felt both private and terribly exposed. Arabella was aware of hundreds of eyes watching, hundreds of minds calculating what this meant. The Duke of Rothschild, descending from his throne to claim his mysterious bride. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the careful control in every line of his body. This close, she could see he was terrified. "You came," he said, and his voice held wonder. "I had an invitation." Her own voice was steadier than she'd expected. It seemed rude to decline the crown. His lips twitched, almost a smile. The crown. Of course. And I needed to see something. What? Arabella stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Around them, the whispers intensified, but she ignored them. I needed to see if the man I married still existed underneath all this. She gestured to the grandeur surrounding them, the guilt and the title and the power. And? The question was barely a whisper. She reached up and traced the scar on his jaw, the one that had frightened her once and now felt familiar as her own heartbeat. You're wearing velvet instead of rags. You smell of expensive soap instead of honest sweat. But your eyes? She met his gaze fully. Your eyes are the same, still watching, still seeing me. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm against his face. Always. From the moment you stood in that rain, I've seen nothing but you. You lied to me. I did. You let me believe you were powerless when you held more power than anyone in this room. Yes. You let me pity you, protect you. His smile was sad. That last part was real. I needed your protection more than you knew, not from poverty or hardship, but from forgetting what matters. You reminded me. Every day in that cottage, you reminded me that titles are just noise, that the only nobility that matters is in here. He placed his free hand over his heart. That's very pretty, Arabella said, and was pleased to hear her voice held steady. But pretty words aren't enough, not after everything. Pain flashed across his features. I know, Arabella, So I have conditions. He went very still. Conditions? If I'm to be your Duchess, truly your Duchess, not just in name, then I need your honesty. Complete honesty. No more secrets, no more omissions, no more protecting me from truths you think I can't handle. Done, he said immediately. I'm not finished. She pulled her hand from his face, needing the distance to say what came next. I also need partnership. I didn't survive poverty and mockery and chicken coops just to become a decorative ornament in your grand life. If I stand beside you, it's as an equal. Your decisions become our decisions. Something like pride lit his expression. Agreed. What else? One more thing. She took a breath, aware that the entire ballroom was hanging on every word, every gesture. I need you to ask me properly. Not as a transaction at an auction, not as a desperate escape. Ask me to be your wife, as the man you actually are, so I can answer as the woman I've become. The ballroom had gone so silent that the rustle of Gideon's velvet coat seemed loud as thunder as he sank to one knee before her. Gasps echoed off the mirrored walls. A duke kneeling was unprecedented, particularly before an audience. But Gideon seemed to forget they had an audience at all. His attention was wholly, intensely on her. "Arabella Huxley," he said, his voice carrying in the crystalline silence. "You saved me when I was in chains. You defended me when I had nothing. You saw worth in me when the world saw only rags and scars. I have 17 estates, but none of them mean anything without you in them. I have a title that goes back centuries, but it's worthless if I can't share it with you." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her work-roughened knuckles. "Will you marry me? Again. Properly this time. Will you be my duchess, my partner, my equal? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that the best decision I ever made was being in that auction house, waiting for a brave woman to choose me?" Arabella looked down at him. This powerful man on his knees. This duke who'd lived as a pauper. This enigma who'd become her home. Behind him, she could see Clarissa's stricken face, Weatherby's confusion, the shocked titillation of the entire assembly. Let them watch. "Yes," she said clearly. "I'll marry you. Again." The smile that broke across Gideon's face was incandescent. He rose in one fluid movement, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her in front of God. The crown and all of England's peerage. The ballroom erupted. As applause and scandal swirled around them, Arabella pulled back just enough to whisper against his lips, "The cottage. I want to keep the cottage." His laugh was warm and rich and utterly free. "Whatever you want, Duchess. The cottage is yours. I'm yours. All of it, always." "Good," she said, and kissed him again. She'd married a slave to escape mockery. Instead, she'd found a duke. But more importantly, she'd found a man who knelt. And that, Arabella decided as Gideon swept her into the formal dance, made all the difference. My beautiful family. And that is how a woman who married a slave became the most powerful duchess in England. But here's what breaks my heart. Thousands of you just watched this entire transformation, this complete journey from rags to riches, from humiliation to triumph, and you're about to scroll away without subscribing. After everything we've been through together? No. Here's what you're going to do. Subscribe right now because there are more stories like this coming. Hit that like button because Arabella would want you to celebrate her victory properly. And share this with someone who needs to remember that sometimes the worst decision turns out to be the best one. Comment below telling me your favorite moment. Was it the market confrontation? The bread making? The final reveal? I need to know. Don't make me beg like Gideon had to. Just click the buttons. Do it for Arabella. Do it for love. Do it because you know you want to. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team. See you in the next story.